At 7:12 a.m., my wife is sitting on our front steps with a latte and a chrome ankle cuff like she's in a minimalist prison ad. A daisy chain of padlocks is looped through our porch railing, and a sign zip tied to the top spindle reads Temporary Compliance Restraint by order of Willow Park Estates HOA. My neighbor is filming. A drone is buzzing overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a leaf blower hits a triumphant key change that sounds almost celebratory in the morning air. Name's Nolan Price. I moved into Willow Park Estates in Northbrook Hills for the quiet life with bird feeders, cul-de-sacs, and polite nods between neighbors who mind their own business. I'm a low-profile guy with a not-so-low-profile job I hadn't told the neighborhood about yet. I was fresh off the swearing-in as the city's new police chief, but I figured that information could wait until the appropriate time. My wife Jenna is the sort of person who leaves cookies for delivery drivers and remembers everyone's birthday. She volunteers at the library and grows tomatoes that she shares with anyone who asks. Our antagonist in the suburban drama is Beatrix Crowley, HOA president, a woman who treats the bylaws like scripture and carries a measuring tape like a sword of justice. It started with what I can only describe as politely deranged behavior. Beatrix began tacking warnings to our door for crimes that seemed pulled from a parallel universe where logic went to die. Our mailbox font was apparently too jaunty for the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. The birdhouse we installed showed clear avian favoritism by being painted blue instead of the approved beige. But the crown jewel of her complaints was that our visible compost bin suggested moral decay and a disregard for property values. These weren't just verbal warnings either. Each came on official HOA letterhead with multiple fonts that seemed to be fighting for dominance on the page. She escalated to what she called pre-dawn compliance checks, which involved stalking through the hedges at 5:30 a.m. with a clipboard and the posture of a Victorian ghost census taker. I'd catch glimpses of her through the kitchen window, measuring the height of our grass with actual calipers while muttering into a voice recorder. The rumors she spread were creative, I'll give her that. According to the neighborhood gossip mill that Beatrix fed like a devoted farmer, Jenna apparently harbors contraband ivy in our basement, and I supposedly store police motorcycles in the pantry, which would be impressive given the size of our pantry. Then Beatrix cited us for porch loitering after sunrise, which was literally just Jenna reading a book on our own front steps with her morning coffee. The next violation was for an unauthorized coffee cup hue because apparently Jenna's favorite teal mug wasn't HOA beige and therefore constituted a visual assault on the neighborhood's carefully curated color palette. We ignored the noise, figuring she'd eventually find a new target for her bizarre crusade. But Beatrix upgraded her tactics to outright trespassing. I found her in our backyard at 6 a.m. measuring our grass with calipers and taking soil samples in tiny labeled bags. She was photographing our pantry through the kitchen window, claiming she needed to verify serial alignment for a community wellness audit she'd invented that morning. On Tuesday morning, everything changed. Jenna politely declined Beatrix's request to temporarily remove our front steps so the compliance committee could check the soils vibe, which Beatrix insisted was a legitimate HOA concern related to foundation integrity and community chakra alignment. Beatrix returned 30 minutes later with a handyman named Carl, a heavy chain that looked like it belonged on a ship's anchor, and a laminated emergency interim restraint order featuring a clip art gavel and 4 fonts that had clearly never met before and were not getting along. Before Jenna could even process what was happening, they had chained her ankle to the porch railing. Beatrix explained in a tone that suggested she was doing us a favor that this was to prevent escape during the mandatory compliance review. The handyman Carl looked increasingly uncomfortable as Beatrix pulled out her phone and dialed 911 to report what she called a domestic disturbance. She wanted responding officers there so she could narrate the situation to them like she was hosting a nature documentary about suburban crime. Her script, which she'd actually written on index cards, described me as belligerent despite the fact I wasn't even home yet. She called Jenna hysterical even though my wife was calmly sipping her coffee and live tweeting the entire absurd situation. The porch was described as an at-risk structure that posed an immediate threat to neighborhood safety. The handyman Carl, finally realizing he was actively participating in what any reasonable person would recognize as a felony, began backing toward his truck with the expression of a guilty raccoon caught in porch lights. I pulled into the driveway just as Beatrix was on the phone with emergency services, gesticulating wildly at our garden gnome as if it were Exhibit A in a major crime. I stepped out of my car in my quiet guy weekend hoodie, the one Jenna bought me that says "World's Okayest Husband." I walked up to the porch where my wife sat chained like a medieval prisoner, though she seemed more amused than distressed. She raised her coffee mug to me in greeting and said with a perfectly calm voice that Beatrix had finally lost what remained of her grip on reality. I set my own coffee cup down on the porch railing, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my badge. The words came out steady and clear. Chief Nolan Price, and just so everyone's aware, my body cam has been rolling since I stepped out of the car. The look on Beatrix's face was like watching someone's brain perform an emergency reboot. 2 patrol units had just rolled up expecting to find actual chaos. Instead, they found a woman in an HOA visor theatrically pointing at a garden gnome while my wife sat chained to our porch, offering the officers some of her homemade banana bread she'd been saving for the mailman. I read Beatrix the relevant statutes while the officers took notes. Unlawful restraint, a second-degree felony in our state when it involves restricting someone's movement without legal authority. Criminal trespass for her repeated unauthorized entries onto our property. False reporting for calling 911 with a fabricated emergency. And my personal favorite, misuse of something our state code actually calls a citizen's abatement chain, which is supposed to be used only for securing abandoned property, not for chaining law-abiding citizens to their own porches. Her face went through what I can only describe as a full software update. First confusion, then recognition, then the kind of panic you see in someone who's just realized they've been live-streaming their crimes to law enforcement. Her board members, who had been lured by the promise of drama, materialized on the sidewalk like moths to a very legally problematic flame. One of them, a woman named Dorothy who always wore pearls even to check her mail, whispered loud enough for everyone to hear that she'd told Beatrix zip ties would have been classier. Another board member suggested maybe they should have consulted actual lawyers instead of just printing things from the internet. The HOA's emergency meeting that evening turned into what I privately referred to as public safety karaoke night. I attended with my laptop and a projector I borrowed from the station. Slide 1 showed body cam footage of Beatrix reading her fake legal document off what looked like a scroll she'd printed at home, performing it like she was auditioning for the role of Renaissance fair bailiff. She'd even added whereas and heretofore in places that made no grammatical sense. Slide 2 displayed the Treasury records, because a subpoena had landed on the HOA's desk faster than their newsletter had ever been delivered. The record showed HOA funds being used to purchase items listed as executive restraint kit, which turned out to be the chains. Something called a decorum drone, which was the unauthorized surveillance device hovering over our property. And my absolute favorite line item, a gavel holster in rhinestone, because apparently Beatrix needed her gavel to be both accessible and fabulous. The room gasped in perfect HOA unison, which sounded like a synchronized intake of lemon water at a country club. When the vote to remove Beatrix began, the treasurer tried to delay on what he called a point of vibe order, arguing that the feng shui of the room wasn't conducive to major decisions. My officers, who had been politely standing in the back of the room, stepped forward to escort Beatrix outside where the chain that had started this whole incident was now tagged as evidence. The delicious irony was that the temporary backdrop we used for her mugshot was painted in HOA-approved beige, the exact shade she tried to force on the entire neighborhood. By Friday afternoon, Beatrix Crowley was officially suspended from the board, formally charged with unlawful restraint, filing a false report, and misappropriation of HOA funds. Her plea deal, which her lawyer negotiated while looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, included full restitution to the HOA, 200 hours of community service specifically removing illegal chains and locks throughout the neighborhood, and the crown jewel of consequences, a 2-year ban from serving on any HOA board in the entire county. The judge, who seemed to be enjoying himself more than judges usually do, also sentenced her to attend a court-mandated boundaries workshop titled No You May Not, which focused on understanding personal property rights and the limits of civilian authority. When the sentence was read, Beatrix's face turned a shade of red that definitely wasn't HOA approved. She sputtered something about appealing to a higher HOA authority, which doesn't exist, while her lawyer gently guided her toward the exit, probably calculating how many billable hours this absurd case had cost her.